Good afternoon, classroom. Today we'll be studying some cases in the realm of the course on anthropology of law. The discipline law science, reference number of the course 0060. The version is number 04, the module 1 reference number 0060-0104. Yesterday we have dealt with the conceptual underpinnings of anthropology of law, of legal pluralism. Today will be more concrete and study some cases, as I said just now. This part of the course, the second part of anthropology of law, so is the course entitled, this part, two cases of legal pluralism, and will deal with female excision and the bearing or the wearing rather of the Islamic scarf. This is a story from the summer 1981. A man, Norbert Roulin, an anthropologist very well-known anthropologist, was called on the phone by an attorney who was asking him to collaborate with him in the defense of his client. The facts are simple. Mohammed and Fofana Dalla are Muslims and belong to the same ethnic group, the Solinke of Mali. They were married during the year 1978 in their country. They have got a firstborn, a girl, excised as soon as she is born. Mohammed immigrated in France in 1980 and found a place as a commissioner in a buffet of Orly Airport. His wife joined him 2 years later. Another son was born then, a boy who early died. In June 1984, Asa, a girl, came after him. The director of the Center of Mothers and Children Protection informed Fofana about the illegal character of excision in France, without her understanding the case appropriately, for she did not speak French. To the director of the female of women and children protection warned Fofana about the illegal character of excision in France, but as she didn't speak French at that time, she didn't understand all the case, what is at stake. 6 days after the birth of Asa, the second girl, 2 women went to Fofana's house and suggested her to excise her daughter. She accepted. Some minutes later, Asa underwent the amputation of her clitoris and her little lips. Caught by a fever, she has been hospitalized. Asa was cured and healed, fortunately, but the director of the Center of Mothers Protection appealed to the Magistrate General of the Republic. Diverse associations suddenly joined the claimant party. SOS Farm Alternative, SOS Women Alternative, Infancy and Partake Enfance et Partage, Commission internationale pour l'abolition des mutilations sexuelles, the International Commission for the Abolition of Sexual Mutilations, the Confederation for the Family Planning. Fofana was accused. She was accused of complicity of crime, of deliberate violence perpetrated on children of less than 15 years, leading to mutilation or amputation, of infraction leading to head cut. The main question to be asked here is the following. What is the mother's responsibility, and to which extent is she accountable? There are a lot of arguments in support of the fundamentally cultural practice of excision, female excision. A practice or an act apparently barbarous and unjustifiable. But there are a lot of arguments in support of this practice. The practice of excision responds to an ensemble, a complex of cultural data. Its unjustifiable character and barbarity or barbarous character is as fallacious, erroneous as any argument of a cultural imperialistic weight. The actual rate of this practice is overwhelming, though. 70 to 80 millions of women are submitted to this practice, and 5 millions of them have their sex fastened. Most of them live in Africa from the north to the south of the continent, with a number of cases in Indonesia and in Amazonia. It is a millenarian practice. The idea to inscribe on the human body cultural marks is very old. Archaeologists found instruments for tattooing peasant-like paintings of hands with amputated fingers. The first mention of excision is recent, however. It appears at the Ptolemaic period, that means the 2nd century before Christ, during the reign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, where it appears at that period that a document of judiciary character depicts a court procedure between a man and a woman whose daughter has reached the age to undergo excision according to the Egyptian tradition. In our times, some experts strongly recommend the ablation of the little lips. Ablation, that means they take the little lips of the clitoris off. It is said that their erectility, when they are in erection, they are such that they can become very disgraceful or facilitate lesbianism. One author, Ambroise Paré, I think, has underlined the fact some times ago, anyway. During the Enlightenment period, many investigations have been made on the true nature of the clitoris. For some doctors, as a natural organ, the clitoris should be conserved. Others, learned men, on the contrary, think that it constitutes an abnormality, or a sickness rather than they justify then its ablation, its suppression. In 1736, for example, Dionys condemned the hypertrophy of the clitoris. Women who manifest this kind of abnormality or anomaly are called the ribauds, Ribaudes, the ribaud, because they can abuse of it and indulge in sexual impurity, in pollution with other women, indulge in pollution with other women. The reason why it has been condemned in order to prevent these women from a continuous lasciviousness. This operation, it is not so dangerous as one can imagine at first, because it is just a superfluous, a useless, quite useless part, that is, of the clitoris or the little lip, that is ablated, that is taken off, as some experts said. What is to be taken into account here is the association of the clitoris with sexual indecision, facilitating feminine homosexuality in the antiquity, and the dispersion of these practices, that means the multiplication of these practices. And the following question is, from their antiqueness, their antique character, oldness, and their localization, proliferation, can we deduce or infer their barbarianism, their being old-fashioned, as some Europeans usually think? Generally, mutilations, sexual or whatever kind, are not necessarily linked with evolution. Egyptians are of a high, great civilization. The deformation of the head has lasted long in Europe till recently, a century ago only. It has been practiced as in the Egyptian and the Berber traditions, where the head undergo a remold. They transform the head in the circular oblique form. It appeared in Europe in the 13th century. The deformation of the head structure. Some traditional societies, the Pygmies of the equatorial Africa, for example, do not mutilate themselves. The bulk of them, the majority of them, completely ignore excision or the closure of the sex. So, ablation, taking off, suppression of little leaves, female excision, the deformation of head structure, all these are none of uncivilized people practices. Otherwise, the pygmy of the equatorial Africa should have known something about them. But as we say, they do not mutilate themselves, and the majority of them completely ignore excision or the closure of the sex. But this reference in itself is charged with value judgment on the pygmy civilization as a primitive and retarded tradition. Besides, that excision can be assimilated with a technique of men's domination over women should retain our attention so much that expert says excision can be used as a means to dominate women, as some experts say. To my opinion, this is the plausible argument and one of an undeniable historical weight, because men have always dominated women through history down to our days. And they still maintain, man, their domination. But if the anthropologist warns against the reductionist view or the reductivist view of man domination, it seems just to indicate the social function of excision. If anthropologists warns against this reductivistic view of man domination, it seems just to indicate that it is just to indicate the social function of excision. It helps inscribe a social status of the excised person, thus definitely fixing the woman in a given category of sex, in her category of sex, a representation that explains how many women desire to be excised too, because since they can be recognized a certain category, social status, they eventually or most generally would like to submit themselves to this kind of practice. The Dogon, Dogjon, of Mali, whose mythology is known to be extremely rich, explains the practice as follows. The child comes in the world endowed or imparted with two sexes, different one from the other, and theoretically it belongs to the one as well as to the other. The sex of his personality is non-differentiated. Double is double. Practically, society, by way of anticipation, recognizes the apparent sex at the start, the one that shows itself, male or female. Practically, this is what society takes into account. But mythologically, the newborn is said to be having two sexes. Endowed, imparted with, or granted with two sexes, the child keeps the instability of his personality. A man with two sexes can have almost no definite personality. This is what we know today from the thesis of people who want to change their sex, the transsexual, and people who want to defend their homosexuality, lesbian, and so on and so forth. But his first years, said the Dogon, are marked with this instability. As long as he conserves his prepuce or her clitoris, the basis of the principle of sex contrary to his apparent sex, male and female character will have the same force. As long as the newborn conserves his prepuce, the penis, or her clitoris, the basis of the principle of sex, of contrary to his apparent sex. That means that is the principle that is hidden, which is not apparent, either male or female, will have the same force, or both will have the same force. That means still the personality of the newborn is to be determined. Therefore, it is not good to compare the circumcised with a woman. It is not good to compare the one who has his how do you call it? The envelope of his penis cut, the circumcised, with a woman. It's not good to compare both of them. Just like the non-excised girl, male as well as female. It is not good then to compare the circumcised with a woman. Just like the non-excised girl, male as well as female. Were the decision on his sex to last, the being will never have the propensity to procreate, since the person has no determined personality. He will not be prompted to procreate. Indeed, the clitoris begotten by the girl is a symbolic twin, a malefactor, with which he can never procreate. I mean, the clitoris stayed only as a symbolic thing. And with that symbolic thing, deprived of any mythologically or social, traditional, procreative principle or activity, the girl can never procreate, can never be pushed to procreate. And it will prevent him or her from copulating. The non-determination, the lack of determination of the sex of the girl or the boy will prevent him or her from copulating with a male or a female. Just like God has seen the organ of the earth erected in front of him. The man who will copulate with a non-excited woman will be beaten. And consequently, there will occur a conflict between him or her with the sex that will pretend to be his or her equal. It's like there is a conflict between the person and his or her own sex. Just like they explain in this way, just like God has seen the organ of the earth erected in front of him. What it really means, it's to be found, to be figured out. Besides, the individual will be abnormal in both male or female dimension. Therefore, it is necessary for one principle to supersede or dominate over the other. More than one nation, including the Western nations, have got the same conception like the Dogon. So it is far from being a primitive tradition. There are facts that show that Western nations have got the same conception. Sigmund Freud, for example, did not escape the fact being of a divine essence. The primordial androgynous of Freud, androgynous means the man with two sexes, very often asserted by numerous foundational myths, Plato, is inscribed in the genital organs of the two sexes. Sigmund Freud, agreed with Plato and talked a lot about primordial beings of two sexes. Is that a myth? Is that a real fact? We don't know. The heterosexual union proper to man and his accession to the adult age persists through the suppression of the vestiges of one of the two types of sexes. The heterosexual union, the wholeness of man or woman at the beginning, should necessarily be the sex should necessarily be determined, and one of them should be suppressed before that man or that woman can be a real human being, imparted with a determined sex. In fact, it is mostly the monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam, that sexual mutilations have ceased to be rituals of differentiation and have become marks of religious belongings practiced from the moment of the child's birth. Circumcision is said by experts to be the mark of Judaic or Muslim identity. This thesis shows an undeniable ignorance of other people's practice from which the Jews and the Muslims have inherited these practices. For long before the Jews, ancient Egypt has indulged in this practice, a tradition which she has transmitted to the Judaic tradition and to the Muslims. Excision in Muslim nations tend at large to become an instrument of masculine domination, as said before, supposedly imposed by the Quran. It seems, however, that this intellectual montage, intellectual devices simply display the hidden sentiment of men towards women. This intellectual explanation displays a hidden sentiment and the clear sentiment of man toward women, a sentiment apparently vivid in patriarchal society. Generally, the female sex is perceived as aesthetically repulsive and suffocating. Aesthetically ugly and suffocating. And what is mostly threatening about it is the mythological theme, or the indented vagina, a vagina endowed having teeth. This is what is threatening about it. Threatening for men, of course. Because it is mythologically, it is a mythological theme that vagina is indented. And about 300 versions of this mythological themes are enlisted among the Indian and the Northern America. Only within these people we can enlist about 300 versions of this mythological theme of indented sex, vagina. This myth threatens men of castration at every sexual relation. To this should be added the additional danger of the clitoris, which in state of erection can bite man, as the Dogon of Mali believed too. These myths are not proper to primitives, again, to take into account the witness of psychoanalysts, to become the awareness of the same phobias among Western nations. Psychoanalysts have bore witness to the fact that there are a lot of phobia among Western nations based on those mythological themes. But it may seem to some people that the way the Western people manage them, how they see, how they understand those myths, are objectively superior to that of the so-called primitive people, to the way it is solved in the Fofana's affair. For example, if we look at the way the problems of Fofana's case is resolved in France, we can come to this conclusion. For it may be argued that the Western too are always afraid of women, especially when they show their capabilities to accomplish certain tasks, just the way men accomplish them. But will that be a modern form of their clitorizness or clitority? At the level of phantasm, will this phobia, this frightfulness, the fact that men are afraid of women, would that be a modern form of the phobia of the indented vagina or the like? The anguish of men, however, no more inflict in Western tradition, of course, that anguish of men does not push them in the direction where they will mutilate women, which is a great advantage, undeniably. But the ridiculous, the silliness of the thing is to qualify the actions authorized by Fofana on her child, that means the excision. The ridiculous is qualifying this action as a deliberate violence inflicted on a child. For it is related to a quite different cultural context, which we can disqualify for sure, but which nonetheless, to adequately appreciate her criminal responsibility, does not dispense us of situation the responsibility of Fofana in accordance with the cultural constraints in which her act has been accomplished. What then to do with the so-called cultural right? The right to duly perpetuate one's cultural heritage in a context of legal pluralism on the one hand, and on the other hand, in a context of universal codification of rights of man as man. The question is not solely to privilege one's own culture over other culture in the context, nor to give a predominance of a supposedly universal culture of rights. Rather, the question is to weigh out what can be discriminated and penalized, taking into account both aspects of rights of man, independently of any kind of cultural pluralism, rough or slight, deep or soft, shallow. The problem is very delicate to be solved in a movement of thought, in a stroke of a sentence. Delicate exercise of legal pluralism it is indeed. But it is apparent to freedom of thought. This freedom of thought, which is always appreciated, given more weight, because people in this circumstance appeal to the right to resist oppression. But the right to resistance can be exerted contrary to Western conceptions or legal system. As Norbert Roland, the anthropologist, we are greatly indebted to in this paper, has put it forward, we can refuse to condemn Fofana, but at the same time adhere to what Castoriadis thought on the values judgment, a thought expressed in the following lines. It's my translation. The flagellation of adulteries is not acceptable to us, and the resection of thieves or robbers, criminals, hands as well. The resection of thieves' hands, the flagellation of adultery is not acceptable to us, just like the practice of infibulation, that means a fastening of female sex, the closure of female sex, excision of young girls, and the like. All these are not acceptable to us. My respect of other cultures, say Castoriadis, can never extend to these practices. And the question springs up in my mind from the fact that, to my opinion, there subsists a close relation, a sort of solidarity between this case and others. In this situation, and due to my own values, that is, values I recognize and choose within my own culture, the simple respect of the culture of the other stops. In this situation, and due to my own values, that is, the values I recognize and choose within my own culture, the simple of respect of the culture of the other stops. I try to understand, but I do not respect in the sense of an adherence or acceptance, total acceptance of it. Norbert Roland, strongly embarrassed, refused to plead for Fofana. As I said before, he has been called to collaborate in the defense of a case of excision in France. Why? Because according to Norbert Roulin, according to him, to choose to plead Fofana's cause amount to two main things: to recognize her irresponsible, to recognize her irresponsibility and unaccountability first. I mean, to plead Fofana's cause is to recognize her as unaccountable. The second is the absurdity of the task, according to Norbert Roulin, because to plead for the practice of excision is to adhere to another kind of value, which is different from his own value, cultural value. It's just like abandoning his own value and sharing that, or wholly adopting the value of other person. For a man of Western culture, this second case is untenable, to plead for excision just because of his or her culture. Cultural imperialism laid aside, it is reasonable to hold that these are some types of law that people are forced to choose because they are less unjust. Between two types of law relatively unjust, it is of necessity to abide by the less unjust. And in Fofana's affair, it may be just to choose the type of law which penalizes excision. Thus, we may choose between the respect of the human body and its integrity, habeas corpus. Between this value, respect of the human body and its integrity, and the observation of a cultural principle, merely because it's a cultural principle or value. If there is a conflict, then we have to choose the respect of human body and integrity. However, this choice should not necessarily lead us to a drastic sentence against Fofana, whose irresponsibility and unaccountability should be fully recognized. We choose to respect the human body and integrity instead of endorsing a cultural principle just because it's a cultural principle. But that should not lead us to drastically sentencing Fofana. This position of ours, we call it practical wisdom. And usually it's discarded. People ignore that this kind of position can be adopted. And this is the fair basis to judge cases like that of Fofana. The judges of France are well aware of the reasonableness of this position. That is why, in previous cases, the parquet refused to sue the infraction and qualify it as a crime. This is not a crime, what Fofana did. An act which leads to less severe punishment. They should not severely punish Fofana. By almost the same token, in the same way, Fofana has been sentenced from the 3rd to the 5th of October 1989. She has been recognized guilty, but was so embarrassed that she only condemned her to the packet to 3 years of imprisonment with remission, which is, in our opinion, still enough. It should be less. Experts consider the verdict, the sentence, inequitable but reasonable, remarking that law should not always conform to the principle of equity. According to them, the judgment confirmed Castoriadis' philosophical conviction, but penalties in France became more severe since. Cases like that of Fofana are severely sentenced today. In this field, France stands as lonesome cavalier, lonesome cowboy. No other European country penalizes or represses excision this way. By the end of 1989, another affair occurred and troubled the people of France a lot. The case of the Islamic scarf. This is the second case. At Creil is a locality situated in the zone, it's called in France the zone of prioritarian education, priority to education zone. At some 60 kilometers from Paris, some teenagers of Algeria and Morocco have decided to wear the scarf in the classroom, and an act which is prohibited by the principal and the teaching staff in the name of laicism, secularization. Sooner, the affair became serious. To advocates of the right to difference are opposed those like the spokesman of the Grand Orient of France, the Great Orient, East of France, the Great East or Orient of France is a Masonic obedience, le Grand Orient de France. They oppose advocates of the right to do difference, and they stand against this Grand Orient de France, stands against women alienation, of which the chador is one of the symbols, against certain reaction of the rabbinic hierarchy. They are opposed to the prohibition of the wearing of the kippah, the wearing of the kippah, which is Judaic, in the Judaic tradition, and against the caution of Catholic hierarchy. Cardinal Lustiger refused to condemn the wearing of the scarf. So only the Masonic Grand Orient de France and some so-called elevated person, philosophers, are opposed to people who defend the right to difference. A philosopher as Finkelkraut denunciates the holy alliance of the clergy, and warned that under the veil of or the cover of right to difference, tribalism is destroying the republican education, disintegrating the French society, above all, offering it to the Front National. So, we see that the two cases, this part has been short, but it's quite like the other. How to sentence cases like that, not just because of we adhere to this and that principle, that not just because we are of this culture or civilization, but also because we should take into account people value, cultural value, and they are indulging in their cultural practices. And for this reason, penalties, condemnation should be lowered to the utmost possibility. This is the lesson to be learned, to learn from these cases. And this conclusion is sufficient today for this lesson. What we call practical wisdom should be really taken into account as often as possible. Like Norbert Roland said, to plead for finance cause amount to two main things: to recognize irresponsibility and accountability first. But second, the absurdity of the task to plead for the practice of excision. As he said, for a man of a Western culture, this second case is untenable just because of his or her culture. It is reasonable to hold that there are some types of law that people are forced to choose because they are less unjust. That the respect in cases of conflict of value, the respect of habeas corpus, the respect of the body, human body integrity, the respect of human body, the respect of the integrity of the person should be given more weight in comparison with a cultural adherence or sharing of a cultural principle merely. But this choice should never lead us to condemning people who respect their cultural value. Otherwise, we'll indulge and we'll base our legal practice on principle other than the just, the fair, and sentence people practices on the basis of, say, cultural imperialism. Thank you for today.